Jai Baba.
Jai Baba.
Cathy and I were together for many years helping at Dilruba, and Cathy asked me, since I don't get to the center very often. I lived in North Myrtle Beach for almost 20 years, and Cathy and I both stayed with helping Kitty until she went to Baba in 1991 at the age of 100, and then I actually stayed a little longer, and my mother came, so I was helping her, and then I ended up moving away. And so I haven't been able to come to the center very often, and because I'm here now, Cathy thought it might be fun to just talk a little bit about being at Dilruba. And so I'm going to start, and then Cathy's going to participate, and we'll see how it goes. It's very informal, very casual. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about how I came to Baba. Which was in December of 1969, and I had been living in Berkeley and San Francisco, and I was living after I got out of college, I was living a very, very bohemian life. And I ended up going to Denver to visit a friend, because I wasn't ready to come back east, but I was ready to get out of the West Coast. So I went and visited a friend in Denver, and she had gone to a play audition and met a woman who gave her a Don't Worry, Be Happy card and a universal message. So she came back and she was very excited about all that, and she gave me the universal message, and I read it, and I felt like I couldn't dispute the How to Love God and the 7 Realities. I felt like I couldn't dispute any of it. And I was not seeking anything spiritual at all, but it just all seemed logical to me. So that helped. And then she gave me the Don't Worry, Be Happy card. And I looked at Baba's image, and I had a complete conviction that Baba was God. And this is someone who didn't follow God at all or had any kind of spiritual background. And I just felt that Baba was divine. I had a total conviction. So that was easy. But the hard part was being on the path, trying to be on the spiritual path. So at some point, I used to go to meetings in Denver, and then at some point I came back east, and I ended up in New York, and so I knew about Baba, and I used to go to meetings at Baba House in New York. So I heard about Baba in December of 1969, and I didn't come to the center for the first time until October of 1971. And I came with, everyone knows Bill Files. I used to talk to him at Baba House, and he said he was coming to the center. Would I like to go? And I said, sure. So the first time I came to the center was 1971, and I remember I didn't meet Kitty. I met Elizabeth, but Kitty was in India. And I remember sitting at the lagoon, down by the boathouse, and looking out over the lake, and I remember thinking, just by following Baba, you get all this. I mean, to me, the center was paradise. Now, my background was a librarian, so I loved the Saroja Library, and I used to go into the Saroja Library, and I realized that it could use a little bit of reorganization, a little bit of recataloguing material and everything, to make it a little more along ALA, American Library Association guidelines, and I knew I could do that. So I met Elizabeth, and I offered to, if she ever wanted the library, I used to call it library reorganized instead of Sufism reoriented, I called library reoriented. And she said, yes dear, yes dear. And that was the end of that. So a few months later, she called me and asked me if I could come and reorganize the library. And I was thrilled. So I stayed in the Lookout for about 2 months and worked in reorganizing the library. And I had helpers we had sort of an assembly line, and I would catalog the books, and then they needed catalog cards made, and they needed spine labels on the books. And so I had this very enthusiastic group of volunteers who were staying on the center, and this was, like I say, it was 72, it was January of 72. And one of the very enthusiastic volunteers was Cathy. And so I met Cathy for the first time, and also her dear friend, who a lot of you know, Annie Bell, who's Annie Weld, who became Annie Bell. And Theus was also another very enthusiastic worker. So we had these people, and so we worked in the library. I have to digress for a minute, and I was sitting talking with Cathy on a bench outside the meeting place one time, and when I first met her, and we're chatting away, and she picked up this guitar and started singing, and I almost fell off the bench because I never heard a voice like Cathy's. It's the most beautiful voice I've ever heard. And so maybe because of that we're good friends, I don't know. But we also have a background at Dilruba, which I'll get into. So that's basically how I came to Baba. How I ended up helping at Dilruba sort of segued from that, when Kitty came back. Of course, I met Kitty in 72 when she came back, when she was back from India and I was doing the library work. And I used to go to talk to Kitty, not about anything personal, but that we needed library equipment or library supplies, and I would talk to Kitty. And Kitty and I felt a very strong connection. It felt to me like she was my aunt and I was her niece. It was that kind of a feeling. So I got to know Kitty a little bit, and then it turned out that Jane and Elizabeth were going to India, and they wanted someone to stay in the house with Kitty. And Kitty was in her late 80s at the time, I think. So this was in spring of 72. So Elizabeth asked me if I would come and stay in the house with Kitty, and sure, why not? You know. So of course I did. And so Kitty and I got to know each other much better, and I helped her, and so that I was just helping informally. So from 72 until 77, every time Elizabeth and Jane went away, they would ask me to come and stay and help Kitty. And it just worked out that I did have jobs. I was a librarian, but it just worked out that I had vacation time or something, and I could come. It always worked out. I never knew when they were going to ask me, but it always worked out. So I would come and help. And so I got to spend time with Kitty, and of course Kitty was incredible, wonderful, great sense of humor, and just delightful and charming, and that wonderful British accent. And so then in 1977 I ended up moving to North Myrtle Beach, and I was helping at Sheriar Press at the time. It wasn't Sheriar Books, it was Sheriar Press. And also Elizabeth asked me to help Kitty part-time as a center worker. So it wasn't volunteer anymore. It became in 77 that I was helping part-time, and I was also doing other odd jobs so that I could support myself because I didn't have a lot of income. I wasn't rich anyway. So that's how it all started, that I helped Kitty. And then in 77, like I say, Elizabeth asked me to work part-time. So I'll tell you a little bit about, I'm going to tell you their names too. You probably know. Baba gave the women, the Western women, nicknames, and Elizabeth's name was Dilruba, Stealer of Hearts. Kitty's name was Saroja, which means lotus. And Margaret's name, and Margaret would come on vacations. She was teaching ballet in New York, but she would come over the summer, the whole summer, and stay at Dilruba, and vacations during the school year. And her nickname was Zulika, and I don't remember, it means brilliant beauty. And so I got to spend time with Elizabeth and Margaret, but not as much time. Most of my work was with Kitty, but of course I got to spend time with them too, Elizabeth and Margaret. So a typical day at Dilruba, it was crazy. It was really crazy, and Cathy will attest. And a lot of you who would come over to talk to them, Kitty, everybody wanted to talk with Kitty. Margaret was, Elizabeth was more behind the scenes. She was running the center. And in 1952, Baba had asked Kitty to come back she was in India with Baba, and then came in 52 for the first time to Myrtle Beach, and Baba asked her to come back and be Elizabeth's right hand. And of course, Kitty wanted to stay with Baba, but she wanted to please Baba, and that was pleasing to Baba. And so that's how Kitty ended up helping at the center, and she literally was Elizabeth's right hand. So anyway, typical day would be, people would be coming, and when Margaret was there, a lot of people wanted to see Margaret, and so the living room would be full of people waiting to either see Kitty or Margaret, not so much Elizabeth, a little bit, and this would be till lunchtime, and the doorbell would be ringing, the phone would be ringing, there were people in the dining room, on the porch, in the living room, in Kitty's book room, just everywhere, and the front porch. And it would be kind of crazy, but we got through it. And then there would be a lunch break. And the first day I started working there, Kitty asked me and later Cathy to cook, make meals. And people were always, almost every day, there would be somebody invited for lunch or dinner or both. And sometimes people would come to talk with Kitty, and then she'd invite them to stay for lunch. So the first day, and I can cook a little bit, but I'm not known for my cooking. Cathy's a much better cook. Anyway, so the first day I said, well, Kitty, you've invited, I don't know, maybe 6 people for lunch, whatever it was. I said, there's a lot of people coming for lunch. And I said, she said to me the first day in the morning, she said, don't worry, we have meals, we have a lot of people for meals, but I'll always tell you what the menu is, and I'll always tell you what to make, so you don't have to worry. So the first day, I knew these people were coming for lunch. As far as I remember, I think it was 6 people coming for lunch. And I went to Kitty and I said, well, Kitty, what would you like me to make for lunch? And she said, oh, just look in the refrigerator, you'll find something. So that was kind of typical of what it was like over there. And anything that I did wrong, and Cathy will tell you she did wrong also, we would just take the blame. A lot of times other people would do something wrong, but just to keep the peace, we didn't mind. We knew in our hearts we didn't do anything wrong most of the time. So we'd say, oh, I'm sorry. I would say, Kitty, I misunderstood you. I'm so sorry, I misunderstood. And we would just try to keep things running smoothly. Everybody was trying really hard, and the place was a madhouse, just crazy. So I'll tell you a typical example of what it was like over there, which was after lunch, Kitty and Elizabeth and Margaret, if she was there, would rest in their room, in their rooms, and then they'd get up around 3 or 4 o'clock. So when I was first there, it wasn't my first day, but shortly after that, Kitty said, now, could you please tidy my office, and I'm going to rest, and if you could just tidy my office, and if you could just tidy up a little bit and empty the wastebaskets, and fine, okay, so I did all that, and then Kitty got up from her rest, and she comes up to me, and she's holding her wastebasket from her book room, from her office, which I'd emptied, and she's holding it up, and she comes right up to me, and she was very, very agitated. And she said, why did you empty my wastebasket? You knew I threw away something I wanted to keep. So my typical reaction, instead of getting defensive, I said, I'm sorry, I'll find it. So I started looking through all the garbage, and I didn't even know what I was supposed to be looking for. And so I was trying to find whatever maybe I threw out inadvertently, and I had no idea what. Anyway, then she came up to me and she said, oh, it was a letter, it was on my desk, I found it. So that was all very typical of what it was like over there, and it was a challenge. It was definitely a challenge, but Cathy and I tried to rise to the occasion as best we could, and we just did our best. So let me see what else I wanted to mention. So one story I have about Margaret, and Cathy has more stories. Like I say, most of my work was with Kitty, so Cathy will tell you some more. But one day I said to Margaret, who is very health conscious, as you know, she's very, very health conscious. And I once said to Margaret, it costs a lot of money to be healthy. And she shot back and she said, it costs a lot more money to be unhealthy. I said, you're right. You know, so that was very, and I remember Margaret once told me that Herbert Davy, Kitty's brother Herbert Davy, once said to Baba, oh, don't you think Margaret is beautiful? And Baba said, Margaret has charm. And Margaret told me she'd rather have charm than beauty. So that was very inspiring. So I found that very inspiring. Everything that Kitty did was inspiring. She would be just selfless, completely selfless, all the time, and just there for everybody, and of course there for Elizabeth too. And now she and Margaret bickered a lot, but they were just like, you know, family. They were fun to be with, just because they would let their hair down and really sort of just go to town with how they felt about things and each other. And Margaret was very opinionated, so that was always fun. One thing about being at the center all those years is it was such a magical time, because so many people, visitors came, friends of course, but the Mandali came, Adi came 3 times, Rano came, Meru came, Kitty, Delia, Bao, and a lot of people who met Baba came and gave their stories and gave talks, and of course dancers, musicians, artists. It was incredible. To me, it was magical to be at the center. And I'm talking about from late 70s to early 90s. It was just really, really a wonderful time to be there. And we just loved it. We loved being there. And we loved helping at Dilruba, although it was a challenge. And Kitty once said to me, I asked her about something, and she said, well, you know, Baba loves a challenge. And well, yes, it's true. So it was hard too. I'm not minimizing it. It was difficult because Kitty and Elizabeth, Margaret was on vacation, but Kitty and Elizabeth were such incredible perfectionists, and they'd learned that from Baba. And I'll speak for myself, but I was pretty scatterbrained, and I think Cathy felt the same way. So we would go off and just not be sensitive about things or what would be best to help them. And so we learned. It was a real learning experience. And we felt bad for them because they had to train us because we were so young. And when I first came to Baba, I was 25, I think. And when I first came to the center, I think I was 27. So, you know, we were pretty young and had not been in a spiritual environment. So we had to learn, and they had so much patience with us and so much love. They really did, amazing. Now, Cathy and I, after Elizabeth passed away, she passed away in 1980 at age 84. Then Jane Haynes came and asked us if Cathy and I could stay in the house with Kitty at night because nobody was there at night. And so Cathy and I arranged to be a week on, a week off, and it was like that for 6 years, that we were the only ones, unless we had to go away or something, that was there at night. Night was very intimate, helping Kitty get ready for bed. And one time I was helping Kitty get ready for bed, and I was joking with her, and I said, you know, Kitty, everybody envies me being here with you. And she said, oh, everyone thinks I'm on the 5th plane. You tell them I'm not even on the 1st plane. You know, that's what it was like being with her. She was just so charming, incredible. So, and then, so Cathy and I, and then other women started to help too, because Cathy and I just couldn't do it all. After Elizabeth passed away, Kitty started needing more help during the day as well as evenings. So fortunately, there were other women. And when Cathy and I started, other women were also helping. Carrie Bills was helping, and then Martha Williams came and helped, and who am I leaving out?
Dana.
Dana came and helped. Of course, Wendy came a lot. Wendy would be there and helping. And Buzz Connor was pretty much the only man who was allowed to be there overnight with Kitty. It was a very special privilege. So there were other women, but it was mostly Cathy and myself who did just most of the day-to-day work. And then, as I say, we started staying overnight, and starting in 1980, week on, week off. So that was interesting, you know, to be there at night too. I didn't sleep for 6 years because I felt like I was a night watchman, and I didn't feel comfortable getting a deep sleep. I felt I was supposed to be on duty. So that was challenging. As I said, I know that word comes up a lot, but it was very challenging. So I was just going to see if I had anything else I wanted to mention. Of course, Kitty had incredible energy, and even when she was in her 90s, I'd be lying on the couch waiting for her to come home at Dilruba so I could go to bed. You know, she'd be out till midnight gallivanting around, and she had so much amazing energy, just amazing. She was incredible. And one time she was on the phone with someone who was asking. In those days, you could stay in the center for 2 weeks, and then you needed to get permission to, if you wanted to extend your stay. I don't know if it's still like that. It might be. But so Kitty, I could hear her end of the conversation. We were in the living room, and someone apparently was asking if he could extend his stay past the 2 weeks. And she granted permission, and then she got off the phone and she said, "Oh, he's in second heaven." wait, that doesn't sound quite right. Oh, seventh heaven. That's very cute. So one thing about what Kitty was so inspiring about is she always tried to be cheerful. She was always cheerful, even if she was tired or irritable. And that was very inspiring, to just try to be, I tried to be cheerful all the time. And my nature is just sort of neutral. I'm not really happy or sad. And it was a challenge, again, another word, but it was a bit of a challenge to try to be cheerful when I was helping at Dilruba and helping her and the people who would come. So that was something I worked on, and she was so inspiring about that. And also, one time I asked her, I said, "Kitty, why are there so many unbalanced people with Meher Baba?" And she said, "Oh, no one else will take them." She just, you know, she had answers, she had a lot of answers. So we had a lot of dinner parties that, you know, big parties over there, and a lot of fun stuff. Evelina was a fabulous cook and chef, and Cathy and I would fill in when Evelina wasn't there, but Evelina did most of the cooking, and her cooking was fortunately wonderful. Mine, not so much. we all tried. So there's a lot other stuff too, but and then I wanted to say about with Cathy and I would get together after we met in '72, and then Cathy moved to Myrtle Beach in '79, I think, right? Mm-hmm. And so we would compare Kittyisms. You know, I've given you some Kittyisms, but Kitty had these wonderful ways, zany ways of phrases. So Cathy and I would get together and we'd talk about Kittyisms, and Cathy asked me if I wrote them down, and I was so busy. I said, well, I wrote a few down, but besides helping at Dilruba, I had 3 other part-time jobs, so I was always busy. And so I said, well, I really don't have time to write them down. So Cathy started writing them down, and that ended up, and then Cathy started keeping a diary of being there and what the women said, and beautiful, their observations, and so Cathy's journal ended up becoming the book she wrote, Dilruba Days, and I worked on that too, because my stories are all in Dilruba Days, almost all my stories. I put my stories in there too, and so I worked with Cathy on Dilruba Days, and then that was published in 2018. And then I worked with Cathy and Tom on Tom's book that came out in 2022, More Light. So Cathy and I have a lot of history together. We're very good friends, so we're like sisters, I guess you'd say. So I'm going to turn it over to Cathy.
It's just, as you're speaking, Lois, I'm so thankful to you for the inspiration of talking about the Kittyisms. You hadn't had time to write them down, and that was the beginning of my really writing the Kittyisms down, and then it became so clear to me that I had this incredible opportunity or position working there, and decided to keep a diary. And then it became almost like a discipline that I would keep from going to sleep at night. I would make sure I would write every time I worked at Dilruba, because a few times in the beginning I would be so tired I wouldn't write in my diary, and then a day or two had passed and I hadn't remembered. So I would just force myself to write every night, or afternoon. And as I looked back on the diaries when we started working on Dilruba Days, I was amazed that much of that I might not have remembered. Just the way people say, what was it like living in India or working for so-and-so? Things fuzz out with time. So that was an inspiration that that Baba had you give to me. And of course, I would love to throw the ball back into your court and ask you, because you helped Kitty write Love Alone Prevails.
Yeah, that's true. That I'll briefly talk about that. When I first came to Baba, I read a lot of Awakener articles, and I was fascinated. I hadn't met Kitty, but I was fascinated with Kitty's Awakener articles about her being with Baba in India and on the Blue Bus tour, and just incredible Awakener articles. And so when I first started helping Kitty, we would be in the book room, and I would help her with correspondence, or not with talking to people, but with everything else that needed to be done, and a lot of correspondence. And so I said, Kitty, I love your Awakener articles. If you ever would like, I'd be happy to type them up. In those days we didn't have computers. I'd be happy to type them up in chronological order. I think it would make a nice little book. And she thought that was a wonderful idea. So she said, yes, why don't you start typing them up? So I started typing the Awakener articles in chronological order. And I didn't get too far, and then Kitty one day, and I started doing it there at Dilruba, and Kitty came out one day with this big suitcase. And she said, I found this in my closet, and maybe there's material in here you could start putting into the Awakener articles and sort of add some, maybe this would work to supplement the Awakener articles. Of course, she didn't use that language, but anyway, so I opened the suitcase, and it's full of letters from Meher Baba, signed letters from Meher Baba, and other articles that Kitty had written that had never been printed, and letters from like Will and Mary Backett and people that Baba had asked Kitty to keep. So it was all this original material, and then she kept finding more suitcases and more material, and I realized I couldn't,
Wow.
I had to stop working on just the Awakener articles. I had to start over and incorporate this material. But I didn't want to work with the original material, so of Baba's signed material. So I actually, as I mentioned, Bill Files brought me to the center for the first time, and so he was a good friend of mine, and he worked in the radio station downtown. And so I was talking to him about wanting to photocopy the material so that I could work not on the original material. And he said, oh, well, I work in the radio station in the evenings. Why don't you come down and you can use our photocopier, and we'll charge you 2 cents a page. And so I ended up with something like 800 pages of original material, which it took me a year to photocopy it all, and before I could even start working on it. So then, an incredible material. And so then I started organizing it for Kitty. And I have, fortunately, kind of an aptitude for editing, which I didn't know I did until I started working on Kitty's book. But fortunately, Baba sort of brings the right people to do the work. And so
One of my favorite stories.
Uh-oh.
So Lois says she goes with this original Baba's letters, letters Baba signed to Kitty. You bring them down after hours. And
to the radio station.
And what happened to the Xerox machine?
Oh yes, so this happened several times. I've forgotten that. But so they, as I say, I would do it, and, for 2 cents a page. And of course, Kitty kept trying to give me money, and I just wanted to do volunteer work, and it was so cheap, so that was fine. But one time I was working, and this there are 2 stories, and just working on a couple hours doing the videotaping, and somebody walks into the radio station and this big platter of food. It was like literally this big. And he came up to me, and it was like all this gourmet food and everything. And I right before that happened, I thought, I'm getting a little hungry. And I'd been there for hours. And all of a sudden, this door opens. This man comes in with this giant platter of food. And he comes right up to me, and I didn't even work there. And he said, "Would you like this?" So thank you, Baba. That was great. But the story Cathy's remembering was that I would work on the photocopier. It was one they gave me to use, and then the next day, Bill told me that it would catch on fire. Somebody would go to use it, and it would catch on fire. It never happened when I was working on it, and that happened like 2, 3, 4 times. Where I would work, and I'd get my work done, nothing happened, but the next day the copier would catch on fire. And they finally had to retire that copier. And that was the copier that had all of Baba's signatures. And then I mentioned it to Kitty, and she said, Baba used to say that very often there would be fire connected with his work. So
the machine just couldn't take it,
Well, it went on, and I'm sure it moved on to a better life.
What does a Xerox machine become?
Anyway, so back to Cathy. I interrupted Cathy.
Oh, and that vacuum machine was the one that I cleaned the house with.
Cathy, Cathy will remember, but first Kitty asked me to clean. And I'm a terrible cleaner. I'm really lousy, and I did such a terrible job. And as I mentioned, Kitty and Elizabeth had such high standards and such a perfectionist, and I'm just really bad cleaner. So I was so bad. I wasn't trying to get out of it, but I was so bad that then she asked Cathy to clean, and poor Cathy got stuck with all the cleaning. But I had other chores that Cathy didn't have to do.
Yes, vacuuming was my main job. So some days, the only thing that would get me through, I would sort of think, well, Dr. Gohair was a, doctor, and she had to take care of ducks. So here I am stuck at Dilruba, vacuuming. And some other days I would think of myself as Cinderella, and even Kitty even said that to me one day.
So then you were Martha, or who were you?
Oh yeah, Martha. I felt, one day. Yeah, Lois was having all this wonderful time working on the book, and I was vacuuming,
And washing the cars.
Washing the cars. Oh my God. But after a number of years, I started feeling, I was trying to see the bright side of vacuuming. And what I decided was that I felt like I was being clean. Does that make sense? I just sort of felt like, because I would be, thinking about all the things that could have been better about the way I was being in the world, so I'm trying to not grumble and think of the positive attributes of this.
Other women got to take Kitty out to lunch and dinner, and Wendy, of course, had much time with Kitty, and Joy Miller used to be with Kitty a lot. If you know Joy Miller, she used to live in Briarcliff, and she would get Kitty beautiful outfits. All Kitty's clothes came from Joy Miller, so Kitty always had beautiful outfits to wear, which Kitty was very happy about that, and Joy was thrilled.
So, well, you were talking about Kitty's selflessness, which we've all experienced, and as you may have read, I did put that into the book, that one day I decided to literally stalk Kitty and consciously follow her around to see if I could find a selfish moment. emanating from her being. I think Erich had tried to do that with Baba, you know, just catch him up, and I don't know. And I really have to say that at the end of that day, I could not find one self-centered moment in her life there at Dilruba. It was just astounding. You know, she was so there for all of us, and it was mind-boggling. Yeah, and one day, what was that? Yeah, that entry that I can't. Maybe you could help me remember. Toward the end of her life, she said, "I came for you. That's why I came." I can't remember the sentence or the conversation leading up to it, but she was very rarely talking about herself in any way that would be self-aggrandizing, but she said something about, that's why I came for all of you. And as you may remember, she was born prematurely. The only other moment I've heard her talk about herself in a way that was kind of looking at her life and speaking about it from more of an objective point of view, she told me that when she was born, her mother gave birth to her at home, and I remember Kitty said that when the mother was lying in before and during and after the birth, that they would put straw down on the streets because the streets were cobblestone and the horses' hooves could shatter the atmosphere, and so they put straw. I mean, it's just what a different 1891, you know, a different world. Anyway, Kitty said she was premature. She said she was born at 6 months, I don't know. And she said that her aunt, her mother's sister, came in and saw little wrinkly red Kitty and said, and then Kitty said this very intensely, imitating her aunt, "Oh, that work? For that little brat?" And then Kitty sort of seemed to get a tickle out of it. She said it again. She says, "Yes, that's what she said. Oh, that work for that little brat?" And then she kind of internally stood back and she said, "Yes, but she didn't know the work I had to do."
And she always said she was in a rush. She was even in a rush to be born. And it was true. She once told me that I asked her about being with Baba, and she said she would, in the early days, with the alphabet board, that Baba would start saying, writing on the alphabet board, and Kitty would say, "Yes, yes, Baba," and run off and do the wrong thing. Because she was just always in a rush. So she had to learn not to do that.
Yeah, and I tended to do that, and she said, "Yes, yes. You didn't listen to the rest of my sentence. You just ran off to do what I asked you to do, and I hadn't finished. I used to do that all the time." Yeah, she was just always in a hurry to be born. Yeah. Oh my God.
Well, I'm going to wrap up a little bit, unless you were going to add anything.
There's so many.
I know, there's so much.
So much to say.
Well, it's all in your book. That's the good news. Our stories are all in your book. But one thing, when I was working with Kitty on Love Alone Prevails, this is a quote I wrote down from that she said in Love Alone Prevails, and I don't remember where it is in the book, but she was talking about being at Mehrabad with the Western women. They were at Mehrabad in the early days, and this is what she wrote: "Baba liked us to show our love for him with a cheerful disposition and a dancing heart, full of hope and spiritual vigor." And I thought that was so beautifully expressed, that she put in the book. And basically, what I'd like to close with is some of the things that Cathy and I learned by being at Dilruba. It was all just learning lesson. A lot of times, I love being with Kitty, I love being with Margaret, and I didn't have too much time with Elizabeth. I always felt like, a friend of mine once said that she felt like she was in the 4th grade and Elizabeth was the principal. That's exactly how I felt. But of course, she was wonderful, but she was so dignified, and she didn't really talk too much about her personal life or life with Baba. But she had a wonderful sense of humor, and Cathy would go into the center with her. And what did she say about, they went to the library, the porch library, the blue.
Oh, yeah.
And she said,
yeah, she was talking about the color that Norina had picked for the blue, yeah.
The floor of the
porch. And she remarked, and I did, about the beautiful blue, and she said, something about not the blues, and at that time Khomeini was acting up in the Middle East, and she said not the Khomeini blues, or you know, she had a very
witty,
sense.
witty sense of humor, which was fun to be with. But what I started to say was, it wasn't always easy being at Dilruba. It was very hard in a lot of ways, and a lot of times I have to admit I really didn't want to be there, but I felt like if I was following Baba and it was pleasing to Baba for me to be there, then where else would I be? And that was the work that Baba wanted me to do. And I think Cathy had a little better time of wanting to be there. But it was hard. It was hard work.
Oh, that's right. I remember being at Dilruba together one day, and both of us were like being driven loony by the situation.
Whatever it was.
And yeah, whatever it was. And Lois was walking down the hall, and she looked at me and she said, "Agony." And then she told me later that she had seen a cartoon with Daffy Duck saying agony. So often when we're talking about our problems, then we'll break into agony.
But what's the point of being with Baba if you're not pleasing Baba? And that's the way I felt, and that really got me through it. And of course, the wonderful times made up for everything. They're just incredible times. But I'd like to tell you a little bit about what we learned, because Cathy and I have talked about it many times. And one thing Kitty would tell us is, of course, Kitty's life was Baba's quote of, she was the embodiment of when Baba said, "Let your life itself be my message of love and truth." And Kitty was that. And of course, other Mandali were too, but we got to experience with Kitty that she was like that. And as Cathy said, just completely selfless, totally selfless. When she woke up in the morning, she'd just start her day thinking about the center and the center workers and what work they needed to do. And so most of the time she would just go, her only quiet time was breakfast, where she would get up very, very early in the morning and go and have a quiet breakfast or sit on the porch before we got up, or whoever was there on duty got up to, that was her quiet time. So at least she got that. That was good. But what I started to say was that what Kitty inspired in us was to always be enthusiastic about everything. And another thing she said, in the old days, she was very melancholy, believe it or not, and she learned not from Baba to not brood. She said, don't brood, don't dwell on things, don't brood on things. So she would learn to, in the Indian, for jani do, which means let it go. So Cathy and I learned that lesson also, because a lot of things would go wrong, and there would be misunderstandings, and we'd get blamed for things, and we would just learn to jani do, just keep going, let it go. So,
and I remember Margaret once said to me, "You have no idea how moody Kitty was when we first went to India, and she's a completely changed person from what I knew her as in the early 30s, you know." Yeah.
Well, she had learned that the hard way. Don't dwell on things, don't brood on things. And another thing that we learned from her was, if there was a problem, Kitty would always try to find a solution. So don't complain. Her atmosphere feeling was, don't complain about something, find a solution. And so we learned to try to do that as well. And the other thing I learned from Kitty, which Cathy also learned, was never hurt anyone's feelings. And Baba said to Kitty, always tell the truth with love, and just try to never hurt anybody's feelings. And that was, all those were wonderful lessons that we learned. I don't know if we're able to do them, but we try. So
she was always talking about the most important thing was pleasing Baba, and the way she was so enthusiastic and making Baba her constant companion was so inspiring. And I realized once after after Elizabeth had passed, Kitty had passed, Tom and I were at the center, and Adele came to visit. And as Adele walked into the cabin where she had had permission to visit us, I realized this intense feeling of Baba's presence coming from Adele. And I had this rush of happiness that I was feeling this again, and then the sadness that I hadn't experienced that since and Elizabeth and Kitty and Margaret had passed. That, you know, those of us who had the opportunity to be around the Mandali, that incredible presence that they carried from years and years of being that intensely with Baba. And it was something that I was missing so much. And then it made me feel like, well, the only thing I can do is to try to long for Baba more, so that we'll all become that, more like that.
When you mentioned Margaret, Margaret taught in ballet in New York until she was 93. She didn't stop teaching until she was 93, and then she retired and lived at Happy House for many, well, 5 more years. She passed away at 97. So, but she got to come and stay on the center, and I know Cathy had a lot of wonderful times at Happy House with Margaret. I would bring Kitty to Happy House to be with Margaret, and so they would reminisce a lot, and that was wonderful for us. But the other point I wanted to make was that one time I asked Kitty, is it better to stick, if you have an original plan, is it better to stick with your original plan, or what should you do if you have a plan? And Kitty said that from Baba, that Baba always said to stick with your original plan, but be flexible to change. So that, any changes. So that was another thing I wanted to mention. And then I'd just like to end with a quote. Like I mentioned, we did correspondence. Kitty would dictate to us, and we'd write it down. And Kitty would just sort of spontaneously dictate, and we'd have to write it down and try to make it make sense. And so I would try to make it write and make it make sense, because when we're dictating something, it always isn't clear. And then Kitty would say, "Read it back to me," and I'd have to try to remember to read it back to her the way she said it, not the way I was writing it. So that was fun. But what I wanted to say was there was a letter. Kitty dictated a letter to a couple, and then she would ask us to mail the letters. Well, this quote I want to read to you, share with you, that in this letter that she wrote, was part of the letter. But before I sealed it, I was so taken with this quote that she dictated in the letter spontaneously, that before I sealed it, I wrote it down. So I'd like to end with this excerpt of this letter that Kitty dictated to a couple. And what she said was, "Whatever transpires, we know, giving everything to Baba, that it will be what he plans. My experience has been that Baba does not usually advocate a routine for life that never changes, but brings about certain changes in our lives that fit in with this plan, for the growth of the individual in their spiritual pursuit of the meaning of life." Jai Baba.
Jai Baba. Thank you.
Cathy and I always say, "You're the best." The other one says, "No, you're the best." Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Jai Baba.
Can I ask a question? What you just said toward the end there, Bob was saying, stick with your original plan, but be flexible. So how would you interpret that?
just to try to follow the original plan, but be aware of if there have to be changes, to be flexible, that if you do need to change the plan. But it was always better to stick with the original plan if you could. That was my interpretation.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and I think that I heard that from them also, and I think sometimes it's a challenge because you get something at a certain time and then somebody later, and you may want to prefer to be with that later situation, but to honor the first situation, I think it seemed like that would be what they both suggested.
Yeah. Stick with the original plan. Right.
And another thing Elizabeth said was, when you mail letters, take Baba's name. I don't know. So that, every opportunity to...
Remember Baba.
Yeah.
Do things stand out now that you do, like each day or in your life, that comes from them?
One thing that is a reminder from what Lois said, that Kitty would just go and go, but many times she was like really exhausted at the point of illness almost, but following through on an invitation. So one morning she was really on the verge of illness. The Taishas had invited her for dinner. I left to work for the day. I came back. She wasn't home yet. And she comes back like, I'm there at like 9 o'clock, and she comes back at 10:30 or 10 o'clock. And I said, Kitty, but you weren't feeling well. And she said, well, I remember during the Blue Bus tours that I wasn't feeling well, and I don't know if it was the Lahore Zoo or something, and I said, Baba, could I stay in the bus? And Baba looked so, he wished that I would come, and she, dragged herself off the bus to look at the animals in the zoo, and she's not feeling well. So she was talking about how to please Baba is to please others. So she said, I was thinking that the Taishas would be unhappy if I didn't come. So she went out of her way, and in going there, she was so happy to be with them that she, ended up feeling better by the time she came home. And she had that incredible energy. We would drag ourselves in, in our 35, 40, and she was like 89 or 90, and once I said, Kitty, how do you do it? She says, oh, well, I never felt tired until I was 60 or 70.
And that reminds me of, they used to rest after lunch, and then they'd get up around 3, 4 o'clock. And that reminds me of one time she got up from her rest, and she was in her 90s. And she said, yes, I find that one can't do at 90 what one could do at 80. With that British accent. Amazing. Jai Baba.